candle smoke curls above your bed like a warning from heaven. You feel your bones before you even open your eyes. You hear the footsteps outside your door, heavy, measured, final. You're young, you're royal, you're to the most powerful man in England. None of that will save you now. Tonight, the king will sign the papers that will seal your fate because you betrayed him, not because you threatened the realm, but because your womb failed to produce it. The parchment crackles under his jeweled fingers as he dips the quill in ink that might as be your blood. Each stroke of his signature is a nail in your coffin. Each letter, a step closer. You can almost hear the executioner sharpening, the crowd gathering in the courtyard below, the prayers being whispered for soul. You weren't the first. You won't be the last. This is not just a story of failed marriages. This is a story of paranoia, blood, and a god complex in a crown. This is the story of how one man's obsession with producing a male heir turned him into a monster who would break churches, and rewrite the laws of God and man to satisfy his own twisted need. 6 women would call him husband. 3 would be cast aside like broken toys. 2 would lose their heads to his executioner's axe. Only 1 would give him desperately wanted. And even then, it wouldn't be enough. Because when you believe you're God's chosen king, not even a son can save you from yourself. Before dive horrific stories of Henry's wives, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider subscribing for more content like this. And please, favorite time period. I might make a video from that soon. I believe these forgotten voices deserve to be remembered. Hit subscribe and comment below. What's one historical practice you think people will look back on in 200 years with horror? In the golden age of European music, when opera houses rose like temples to human artistry and church choirs competed to touch the very throne of heaven, there existed a problem that seemed insurmountable. The Catholic Church, in its infinite wisdom, had decreed that women could not sing in sacred spaces. Their voices, tainted by Eve's original sin, were deemed unworthy to praise the Almighty within consecrated walls. And articulate, quoted Shakespeare like an with the fluid grace of a born aristocrat, breathlessly reported his fashion choices, conversations about art and literature, his cultured duchesses swoon when he smiled, when he laughed, untouched by the roughness that comes with masculine maturity. He was 18 opium when he discovered the physicians for a prescribed by royal instant anxiety. The dose dissolved, the persistent voice whispered despite he might not actually be worthy. The second dose made him feel like a god. Up before his gambling debts began piling thousands, not hundreds of pounds, enough to bankrupt entire cards for 18 hours straight. He'd sit his pupillated betting money he didn't have on hand. When he lost, he couldn't remember, which was often he'd fly into rages that left furniture. The women courtship expected of a prince, not the rough encounters that left him feeling grasping than before, seeking royal protection. Married ladies, young girls pushed forward, ambitious patronage, everything else. He consumed voraciously, his interest waned. By his mid-20s, often from families so poor that selling their sons seemed like salvation rather than sacrifice, possessed voices that could make grown men weep with their beauty. Alessandro Moreschi was one such boy. His alleged servant girls who fled his presence. They didn't see this from Carlton House. They hear the screams in secret. They didn't know about the physicians who visited, who came and went through the cleaners who scrubbed stains from carpets and never fell in love somewhere beneath the layers of powder and for being so easily fooled. Began to hang George, this man who would become a creature of appetite and rage, preparing to rule over a seal that worshipped the very Father Benedetti, the local priest, had heard thousands of boys sing over his decades of service, but never anything like this. Here was a voice that could carry the prayers of the faithful straight to heaven's gates. Word traveled quickly through ecclesiastical networks. By the time Alessandro was 8, representatives from the papal choir in Rome had made the journey to his family's humble stone cottage. They spoke to his parents in hushed tones about divine calling, about the great honor being offered to their son. They spoke about opportunities that could lift the entire family from poverty. They did not speak about the price. The castrati, for that is what these preserved voices were called, had become the greatest musical celebrities of their age. Farinelli commanded the attention of kings. Senesino earned fortunes that dwarfed those of nobles. Caffarelli lived in palaces and counted royalty among his intimate friends. Their voices, forever frozen at the moment of perfect beauty, could sustain impossible melodic lines and reach notes that seemed to exist beyond human capability. But behind every celebrated castrato were hundreds more who never achieved fame. Boys who underwent the procedure only to discover that the knife had taken everything while giving nothing in return. For every Alessandro Moreschi who would one day sing for popes, there were countless others who died on crude operating tables, or lived their truncated lives in obscurity, their sacrificed masculinity, buying them nothing but a lifetime of existing between categories. No longer boys, never to be men. The Church never officially sanctioned the practice. Papal bulls condemned the mutilation of children, and canon law explicitly forbade it. Yet everyone understood the elegant fiction that protected all involved. The boys had suffered accidents, attacks by wild boars while hunting, kicks from horses, falls from trees that just happened to damage them in precisely the way that would preserve their voices. The Church could maintain its moral authority while still enjoying the services of these living angels whose very existence testified to divine providence working through mysterious ways. In the conservatories where these boys lived and trained, they learned not just music but how to inhabit their new identity. They were taught to move through the world as neither fully male nor female, but as something unique and apart. Their elongated limbs, a side effect of the hormonal changes brought about by their surgery, gave them an otherworldly appearance that audiences found both beautiful and unsettling. Alessandro learned to carry himself with the dignity that his gift demanded, even as his body grew in ways that marked him as different from other men. He would never develop the broad shoulders or deep voice of masculine maturity. Instead, he became something rarer, a living embodiment of musical perfection that could never be naturally achieved. When he first sang Ave Maria in St. Peter's Basilica, his voice ascending to the great dome above, even the hardened Vatican courtiers found themselves moved to tears. Here was proof that God worked through human instruments to create beauty beyond earthly comprehension. The fact that this beauty required the destruction of natural development seemed, in that moment of transcendence, a small price to pay. The surgery was always performed in secret, usually in the back rooms of monasteries or the private chambers of physicians who asked no questions and kept no records. The Church's official position meant that no respectable doctor would acknowledge performing such procedures. Yet somehow hundreds of boys underwent the operation every year across Italy. They were typically between 7 and 9 years old, young enough that their voices had not yet begun to change, but old enough to survive what was essentially a form of ritualized violence, disguised as medical intervention. The younger ones had better survival rates, their small bodies more likely to heal from the trauma, but they also had less understanding of what was being taken from them. The procedure itself was brutally simple. The boy would be given wine mixed with opium if the family could afford it, or simply told to bite down on leather if they could not. Sometimes they were lowered into baths of scalding water until they lost consciousness, the heat serving as crude anesthesia. The surgeon, often nothing more than a barber with steady hands and a reputation for discretion, would make quick work with a sharp blade, removing the source of masculine hormones that would eventually deepen the voice. There was no understanding of sterile technique, no antibiotics to prevent infection, no modern surgical tools. Many boys died from blood loss or fever in the days following the operation. Those who survived faced weeks of agony as their small bodies tried to heal from trauma that nature never intended them to endure. The Rossetti family made their choice on a cold February morning when their youngest son Marco had just turned 8. They had watched their neighbor's boy, Giuliano, return from Rome the previous year, transformed into something almost magical. His voice had earned him a position in a cardinal's household, and the money he sent home had bought his family a new house and freedom from debt. Marco's father held his wife as she sobbed, knowing that they were trading their son's future manhood for the possibility of survival. The winter had been brutal, the harvest poor, and they had already lost one child to hunger. The men from the conservatory had been clear. Marco's voice was exceptional, but time was running short. Soon puberty would steal away whatever gifts God had given him. The operation took place in a monastery outside Naples, performed by a man who called himself Brother Francesco but whose hands shook too much for genuine religious devotion. Marco was given wine until he could barely stand, then strapped to a wooden table while incense burned to mask the smell of blood and fear. When he woke 3 days later, delirious with fever, his mother was beside him weeping and praying. The bleeding had finally stopped, but the boy who had run through olive groves just days before was gone forever. In his place was something new, a living sacrifice to the strange mathematics of musical perfection. The recovery was slow and painful. Marco's voice, when he was finally strong enough to sing again, remained exactly as it had been, clear, but his body began to change in ways that marked him as different from other boys. He grew taller than his brothers, but remained slender, his limbs elongating in proportions that seemed almost ethereal. Facial hair would never come. His voice would never crack or deepen. He would never father children or experience the full range of human sexuality. In return, He could sustain notes that seemed to last forever, could ornament melodic lines with decorations that sounded like celestial flourishes, could move audiences to tears with the sheer beauty of sound that poured from his altered body. The conservatory in Naples, where Marco was sent for training, housed 40 other boys like him, all of them existing in a strange liminal space between childhood and something else entirely. They learned music theory and vocal technique, but also how to present themselves to a world that saw them as either angels or abominations, depending on the observer's perspective. Their teachers were often castrati themselves, men who had undergone the same transformation decades earlier, and now passed on not just musical knowledge, but the complex emotional skills needed to survive in their unique position. They learned to smile graciously when audiences stared at their unusual proportions, to deflect questions about their altered state with wit and charm, to channel whatever pain or anger they felt into their art. Some thrived under this system. Giuseppe Milico became wealthy and famous, beloved by audiences across Europe for his ability to convey profound emotion through pure sound. He owned several houses, maintained a carriage with liveried servants, and was received in the salons of the nobility as an equal. Others were less fortunate. Records from the period speak of castrati who never achieved professional success, who spent their lives as church singers in small parishes, their sacrifice buying them nothing more than a modest living and the strange isolation that came with their condition. Some descended into alcoholism or madness, unable to reconcile what had been taken from them with what little had been given in return. The church maintained its careful silence about the practice, but the evidence was everywhere. Choir payment records show astronomical sums paid to castrati while regular adult singers earned pittances. Correspondence between bishops reveals careful discussions about acquiring the services of specific boys before their voices could be lost to nature. Training manuals for church musicians include detailed instructions for working with castrati voices, acknowledging their existence while never discussing their creation. The hypocrisy was breathtaking in its scope. The same institution that preached about the sanctity of the human body, that condemned any modification of God's creation, that held up celibacy as the highest form of spiritual dedication, was systematically enabling the mutilation of children to serve its aesthetic preferences. Yet the music they produced was genuinely transcendent. When Alessandro Moreschi sang the Crucifixus from Mozart's Mass in C minor, his voice carried a quality of suffering that seemed to embody the very essence of sacred sacrifice. The irony was lost on few who heard him here was a voice that had been created through suffering, singing about divine suffering, in service to an institution that had enabled his pain. Alessandro Moreschi stood 5 feet and 10 inches tall, unusual height for a man of his era, made even more striking by the ethereal quality of his proportions. His face retained the smoothness of perpetual youth, unmarked by the coarsening effects of masculine hormones, while his eyes held depths that spoke of experiences no ordinary person could understand. By 1883, at the age of 25, he had become the most celebrated soprano in the Sistine Chapel Choir. His voice, renowned throughout Catholic Europe for its otherworldly beauty and technical perfection. Pilgrims would travel hundreds of miles just to hear him sing during high masses, and Vatican officials used his performances as diplomatic tools, knowing that few experiences could move foreign dignitaries as powerfully as hearing Moreschi's voice soar through the sacred spaces of St. Peter's. Pope Leo XIII, a man known more for his intellectual rigor than his emotional expressiveness, was said to weep openly when Moreschi sang certain passages from the liturgy. The pontiff would sometimes request private performances, sitting alone in his chambers while the castrato's voice filled the space with melodies that seemed to dissolve the boundaries between earth and heaven. But behind the public adoration and papal favor lay a more complex reality. Moreschi lived in apartments within the Vatican complex, surrounded by the trappings of success but existing in profound isolation. He could never marry, never father children, never experience the full range of human relationships that others took for granted. His closest companions were other castrati, men who shared his unique circumstances but who also represented constant reminders of what had been sacrificed for their art. The daily routine of Vatican life provided structure but also highlighted his liminal existence. He attended morning prayers with the other clerics, but he was not ordained and never could be. His altered state made him ineligible for full priesthood. He dined at tables with visiting dignitaries who praised his performances while studying him with the fascination typically reserved for exotic curiosities. Moreschi's correspondence, preserved in the Vatican archives, reveals a man of surprising complexity and intelligence. He wrote extensively about music theory, developing ideas about vocal technique that influenced pedagogy for generations. But he also struggled with profound loneliness and a sense of existing outside the normal flow of human experience. In one letter to a fellow Castrato, he wrote, "Sometimes I wonder if we are the blessed ones or the cursed ones. Our voices carry prayers to God's very throne, yet we ourselves can never participate fully in the life He created for His children. We sing of love but cannot love completely. We praise creation while being ourselves altered beyond His original design." The irony of his position was inescapable. As the most famous castrato of his generation, Moreschi represented the pinnacle of a tradition that was already beginning to face serious criticism. Medical understanding was advancing, making clear the brutality of what had been done to these men. Social attitudes were shifting toward greater protection of children and condemnation of practices that harmed them for adult benefit. Yet audiences continued to flock to hear him perform. When he sang Allegri's Miserere Deus during Holy Week services, the Sistine Chapel would fill with an electricity that transcended mere musical appreciation. His voice could sustain the highest notes for what seemed like impossible lengths of time, decorating them with ornamentations that sounded improvised but were actually the product of decades of training and natural gift working in perfect harmony. Foreign visitors often left detailed accounts of hearing Moreschi sing. Cardinal Manning of Westminster wrote, "I have heard the finest sopranos in London's opera houses, but nothing prepared me for the experience of this man's voice in sacred space. It is as if angels themselves were given human form to demonstrate the glory of divine music." The Russian composer Tchaikovsky, visiting Rome in 1884, was less sentimental in his assessment. "The voice is magnificent, technically perfect, emotionally devastating, but there is something tragic in its very beauty, a reminder that human beings will sacrifice anything, even their children's wholeness, in pursuit of artistic perfection. I left the chapel deeply moved but also deeply disturbed." Moreschi was acutely aware of these mixed reactions to his presence and his art. He understood that he represented not just musical excellence but also a living symbol of institutional priorities that placed aesthetic achievement above human welfare. This awareness added layers of complexity to his performances, imbuing even the most celebratory passages with undertones of melancholy. As the 19th century progressed, the tradition that had created him came under increasing attack. Medical journals published articles about the physical and psychological damage caused by prepubescent castration. Social reformers campaigned against practices that harmed children for adult purposes. Even within the church, younger clerics began questioning whether musical excellence could justify such extreme measures. Moreschi found himself increasingly isolated, not just by his physical condition, but by his historical position. He was among the last generation of castrati, a living remnant of a practice that the modern world was beginning to recognize as barbaric. New techniques for training boy sopranos promised to preserve high voices naturally, without surgical intervention. Female singers were gradually being accepted even in church settings. The man who had once been celebrated as the voice of God was becoming an anachronism, a beautiful relic of a more brutal age. Yet his voice remained magnificent, perhaps even more poignant for being among the final examples of its kind. When he sang during the papal masses of the 1890s, audiences were hearing not just exceptional music but the ending of an era. In his private moments, Moreschi began to contemplate what would happen when his voice finally began to fade. Unlike his predecessors, who had lived in an age when castrati could expect lifelong careers, he faced a future where his very existence would be seen as an embarrassment, a reminder of practices the church preferred to forget. The castrato industry operated with the cold efficiency of any lucrative trade, built on a foundation of poverty, desperation, and the church's insatiable hunger for transcendent musical experiences. By the early 18th century, conservative estimates suggest that over 4,000 boys per year were being castrated across Italy, their families trading their sons' masculine futures for the possibility of escape from crushing destitution. The economics were brutally simple. A successful castrato could earn more in a single season than a skilled craftsman might make in a lifetime. Farinelli, the most celebrated singer of his era, commanded fees of £50 sterling per performance, equivalent to roughly $15,000 in modern currency. He maintained households in London, Naples, and Madrid, owned carriages that rivaled those of nobility, and was received at court as an equal to princes. These success stories created a powerful mythology that obscured the far more common reality. For every Farinelli who achieved international fame, hundreds of boys endured the knife only to discover that surgical alteration guaranteed nothing beyond a lifetime of existing between masculine and feminine categories. Many possessed voices that were pleasant but unremarkable, pretty enough for small church choirs, but lacking the extraordinary qualities needed for operatic stardom. The conservatories that trained these boys operated as sophisticated business enterprises, carefully calculating investments and returns. The Conservatorio della Pietà dei Turcini in Naples, one of the most prestigious institutions, maintained detailed financial records that reveal the cold mathematics underlying their operations. Initial surgical costs, plus 3 to 5 years of intensive training, represented an investment of approximately £200 per boy. Those who achieved professional success would eventually repay this investment many times over, but the failure rate was astronomical. Giovanni Velluti, considered the last of the great operatic castrati, left behind correspondence that illuminates the psychological cost of this system. Writing to his patron in 1825, he described the conservatory as a house of broken dolls, where children are reconstructed into something that pleases adult ears, but can never truly live adult lives. His letters reveal a man of considerable intelligence and sensitivity, trapped within a body that had been altered to serve purposes he had never chosen. The recruitment process was highly organized, with talent scouts traveling throughout rural Italy seeking boys with exceptional voices. They particularly targeted families facing economic crisis, those whose crops had failed, who had lost breadwinning fathers, who faced eviction or starvation. The scouts presented castration not as mutilation but as divine calling, suggesting that God had blessed certain boys with gifts that must be preserved for His glory. Parents were given time to consider the offer, but the pressure was enormous. Neighbors who had allowed their sons to undergo the procedure and subsequently prospered served as walking advertisements for the benefits of cooperation. Those who refused often watched their children die of malnutrition or disease, knowing they had passed up what might have been salvation for the entire family. The surgery itself became increasingly systematized, with certain monasteries and private physicians developing reputations for high survival rates. Brother Antonio of San Gennaro was said to have performed over 300 operations with a mortality rate below 10%, considered exceptional skill for the era. His techniques were passed down through informal networks, creating something approaching professional standards for an inherently barbaric practice. The boys who survived faced years of intensive training that went far beyond musical education. They learned languages, deportment, and the complex social skills needed to navigate European high society. Many became surprisingly well-educated, their isolation from normal masculine pursuits creating opportunities for intellectual development that might otherwise have been unavailable to children of their social class. Yet this education came at the cost of emotional and psychological development that could never be recovered. Castrati existed in a strange social limbo, neither fully male nor female, unable to marry in the conventional sense or participate in the family structures that defined adult life for their contemporaries. Some formed intense, quasi-romantic relationships with female opera singers or wealthy patrons, but these connections were complicated by their inability to consummate relationships in normal ways. The Church's role in this system was characterized by layers of denial and complicity. Officially, castration was condemned and forbidden. Practically, Vatican account books show enormous expenditures for castrati services, and correspondence between church officials discusses the acquisition of specific boys whose voices had attracted attention. Cardinals competed to secure the most talented performers for their personal chapels, treating them as luxury possessions that demonstrated both piety and refined taste. Pope Benedict XIV, in a 1748 papal bull, explicitly condemned the castration of boys for musical purposes, calling it a practice contrary to natural law and Christian morality. Yet the same pope continued to employ castrati in the Sistine Chapel and made no effort to enforce his prohibition. The contradiction was so obvious that it became a source of scandal even among Catholics, with some theologians arguing that the Church's actions demonstrated a fundamental corruption of priorities. The decline of the castrato system began in the late 18th century, as Enlightenment ideas about human rights and child protection spread throughout Europe. The French Revolution's emphasis on individual liberty made practices that sacrificed children for adult benefit increasingly difficult to justify. Medical advances also made the brutality of the procedures more apparent, as doctors began to understand the complex hormonal systems they were disrupting. But perhaps most importantly, musical tastes began to change. Audiences grew tired of the artificial perfection that castrati represented, preferring more natural expressions of human emotion. The rise of romantic music, with its emphasis on authentic feeling and individual expression, made voices that had been created through surgical intervention seem increasingly artificial and outdated. By the time Alessandro Moreschi began his career in the 1870s, he was entering a dying profession. The great conservatories had stopped accepting new castrati, and opera houses increasingly preferred female sopranos who could bring both vocal excellence and natural feminine beauty to their roles. The church itself was beginning to distance itself from practices that had become embarrassing reminders of a less enlightened past. The full scope of what castration stole from these boys extended far beyond their reproductive capacity, reaching into every aspect of human experience that defines adult life. Modern medical understanding makes clear that the prepubescent removal of testes didn't simply preserve high voices. It fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of physical, emotional, and psychological development in ways that were poorly understood at the time, but are now recognized as profoundly devastating. Without the hormonal changes that accompany male puberty, castrati grew into beings that were neither fully male nor female, but something unprecedented in human experience. Their bones continued growing long past normal cessation points, creating the elongated limbs and unusual height that marked them as different. Their voices remained permanently fixed at prepubescent pitch, but their lung capacity expanded with their larger adult bodies, giving them the ability to sustain notes for impossible lengths of time. More tragically, their emotional and sexual development remained frozen at the point of surgical intervention. They retained the capacity for affection and even forms of physical intimacy, but could never experience the full range of adult sexuality that gives meaning and completion to human relationships. Some castrati formed deep emotional bonds with women, living in relationships that resembled marriage but could never be legally or spiritually recognized as such. Carlo Broschi, known professionally as Farinelli, left behind correspondence with his longtime companion Caterina that reveals the profound sadness underlying even the most successful castrato's life. In one letter, he wrote, "You love me as I am, but I can never be for you what a complete man could be. I sing of passion but can never fully feel it. I perform love but can never fully give it." The psychological impact was perhaps even more devastating than the physical alterations. These men lived their entire adult lives, knowing that their fundamental identity had been sacrificed for the pleasure of audiences who saw them as exotic curiosities, rather than complete human beings. They were applauded, celebrated, and financially rewarded, but always remained outside the normal flow of human community. Alessandro Moreschi's private writings, discovered in Vatican archives decades after his death, provide unprecedented insight into the inner life of a castrato. His journal entries reveal a man of profound intelligence and sensitivity, struggling to find meaning in an existence that had been shaped entirely by others' choices. "I wonder sometimes what I might have become if left to grow as God originally intended," he wrote in 1891. "Would I have been a father, a husband, a man among men? Instead, I am a voice without a body, a song without a singer, a prayer without a believer." The social isolation was particularly acute because castrati existed in a category that had no precedent in normal human experience. They were neither children nor adults, neither masculine nor feminine, neither fully human nor entirely artificial. Society had created them but had no place for them beyond their specific function as entertainers or sacred performers. Many struggled with profound identity crises, never knowing who they might have become if allowed to develop naturally. They had been transformed into living artworks, but artworks that retained human consciousness and human longing for connection and meaning. The very qualities that made their voices so moving, the sense of loss, the otherworldly timbre, the emotional depth that seemed to come from suffering, were the direct result of trauma that had been inflicted upon them as children. Some found ways to channel their unique position into forms of artistic expression that transcended mere entertainment. Gaetano Majorano, known as Caffarelli, became not just a performer, but a composer and teacher, whose works explored themes of transformation, loss, and the search for identity in a world that saw individuals primarily as instruments of others' purposes. but others descended into depression, alcoholism, or various forms of self-destructive behavior. The contradiction between their public celebration and private emptiness proved too difficult to bear. They were praised for possessing something that had been taken from them by force, celebrated for achieving a perfection that had cost them their fundamental humanity. The Church's treatment of these men revealed profound theological contradictions that some clerics struggled to reconcile. If humans were created in God's image, what did it mean to surgically alter that image for aesthetic purposes? If celibacy was a spiritual choice that brought individuals closer to divine perfection, what significance could be attached to celibacy that had been imposed through mutilation? If the body was a temple of the Holy Spirit, how could its deliberate disfigurement be justified by musical excellence? Some Catholic theologians attempted to address these questions by suggesting that castrati represented a special form of sacrifice, comparable to the self-mutilation practiced by certain saints and mystics throughout church history. They argued that these men had given up their normal human development to serve God more perfectly, making them examples of spiritual dedication rather than victims of institutional cruelty. But this theological rationalization couldn't obscure the fundamental fact that the sacrifice had been imposed on children too young to consent, made by adults who benefited from the arrangement. The castrati themselves often struggled with questions of divine purpose and meaning, wondering whether their altered state represented a spiritual calling or simply the result of economic desperation and institutional selfishness. As medical understanding advanced in the 19th century, the full scope of what had been taken from these men became increasingly clear. They had been deprived not just of reproductive function, but of the complete hormonal and neurological development that shapes adult human experience. Their sacrifice had purchased musical excellence at the cost of psychological wholeness, creating beings who were simultaneously more and less than fully human. Moreschi, in his final years, became increasingly reflective about the meaning of his unique position. "We were made to sound like angels," he wrote in 1920, "but angels are not meant to live on earth among humans. We exist between heaven and earth, belonging fully to neither, carrying within our voices all the beauty we could never experience in our lives." In April of 1902, a revolutionary piece of technology entered the sacred walls of the Sistine Chapel for the first time. The Gramophone company had sent representatives to Rome with a mission that seemed almost impossibly ambitious: to capture and preserve the voice of Alessandro Moreschi, the last great castrato. Using the miraculous new science of sound recording, the significance of the moment was lost on no one present. For over 3 centuries, the voices of castrati had existed only in the fleeting moments of their performance, described in letters and reviews but never preserved for future generations to experience directly. Now, as the 19th century drew to a close, and the practice that had created these unique voices was finally ending, technology offered a chance to save at least one example of what was about to be lost forever. Moreschi was 44 years old, his voice still magnificent, but showing the first subtle signs of age that would eventually claim even the most carefully preserved instrument. The recording session took place in a small chamber adjacent to the Sistine Chapel. The acoustic properties of the space, carefully considered to capture both the purity of his voice and some sense of the sacred environment where he had spent his career. The process was laborious and imperfect. The primitive recording equipment could capture only a few minutes of sound per wax cylinder, and the fidelity was poor by modern standards. But what emerged from those sessions was nothing short of miraculous. The first and only recordings of a true 18th century castrato voice, preserved in a medium that could theoretically last forever. When Moreschi sang Ave Maria for the recording apparatus, his voice carried all the ethereal quality that had made audiences weep for decades. But also something new, a poignancy born of knowing that this performance would outlast not just his own mortal existence but the entire tradition he represented. The recording captured not just musical notes, but a moment of historical transition, the final breath of a practice that had shaped European music for centuries. The sound itself is haunting in ways that go beyond mere musical beauty. Moreschi's voice possesses an otherworldly quality that immediately sets it apart from any natural human sound. The timbre is simultaneously masculine and feminine, adult and childlike, human and something else entirely. Modern listeners often describe feeling unsettled upon first hearing it, as if encountering something that shouldn't exist in nature. But perhaps most disturbing is the emotional content carried within that impossible voice. There is a sadness in Moreschi's recorded performances that transcends the melancholy inherent in sacred music. It sounds like loss itself given voice, not just the loss of innocence or youth, but the loss of an entire dimension of human experience that most people take for granted. The Vatican's reaction to the recordings was complex and revealing. Officially, church authorities expressed pride in preserving such an important example of sacred musical tradition. Privately, many were uncomfortable with creating permanent records of voices that testified to practices the institution increasingly preferred to forget. Some officials worried that the recordings would serve as evidence of the church's complicity in what were now widely recognized as barbaric procedures. Pope Pius X, who ascended to the papacy in 1903, represented the new direction of Catholic thinking about church music. He issued reforms that emphasized congregational participation over theatrical performance and explicitly banned the employment of castrati in Vatican choirs. The era of using mutilated men to create divine music was officially ending, though Moreschi himself was allowed to continue singing until his retirement. The irony was inescapable. At the very moment when technology first made it possible to preserve castrato voices for posterity, the Church was moving to eliminate the practice that created them. Moreschi's recordings became artifacts of a vanishing world, documents of a musical tradition that was already being relegated to history. Modern analysis of the recordings using digital enhancement technology has revealed details that were impossible to discern when they were first made. Moreschi's breathing patterns, his use of vibrato, his ornamental techniques, all can now be studied with scientific precision. But the technology also reveals more subtle elements. The strain in his voice that suggests the physical cost of his unique vocal production, the emotional weight that seems to inform every sustained note. Scholars who have studied the recordings extensively note that Moreschi's voice carries qualities that could never be achieved through natural means. The combination of adult lung capacity with preserved prepubescent vocal cords created possibilities for sustaining notes and executing ornaments that no unaltered singer could match. Yet this technical perfection came at a human cost that adds tragic depth to every performance. The recordings also capture something that contemporary accounts of castrati performances often mention but could never preserve: the uncanny sense of hearing voices that seem to come from beyond normal human experience. There is something genuinely otherworldly about the sound, as if the surgical intervention had created not just altered voices, but portals to a different realm of acoustic possibility. When the British Museum acquired copies of Moreschi's recordings in 1904, the curator wrote, "These cylinders contain the voice of the last castrato, but they also contain something more disturbing evidence of humanity's willingness to sacrifice its children's wholeness in pursuit of beauty." Future generations will listen to these recordings and hear both the most sublime sacred music ever created and the most damning indictment of the civilization that created it. The technology that preserved Moreschi's voice also marked the beginning of changes that would make castrati obsolete. Electric recording, improved microphone technology, and eventually electronic amplification would make it possible to capture and project female voices in ways that had never been practical before. The acoustic limitations that had partially justified the use of castrati were disappearing just as society was finally recognizing the moral horror of what had been done to achieve that unique sound. Moreschi lived until 1922, spending his final years in a small apartment near the Vatican, supported by a modest pension from the church that had both created and celebrated him. He never married, never had children, never experienced the normal rhythms of family life that define most human existence. His recorded voice outlived him, becoming increasingly precious as the years passed and the world it represented grew more distant. Today, those 1902 recordings exist as the sole surviving evidence of what castrato voices actually sounded like. They are housed in climate-controlled archives, digitally preserved and enhanced, studied by musicologists and medical historians who seek to understand both their beauty and their horror. But for all the scholarly analysis, nothing can diminish the fundamental tragedy they represent: the voice of a man singing beautifully about divine love, while embodying the very human capacity for cruelty in pursuit of perfection. In the end, what remains of the castrato tradition is not just Alessandro Moreschi's ghostly recordings or the scholarly debates about musical technique and historical practice. What remains is a mirror held up to human nature itself, reflecting our endless capacity to justify the most profound cruelties when they serve our aesthetic, spiritual, or economic purposes. The boys who were sacrificed to create these voices were not anonymous historical footnotes, but real children with names, families, dreams, and futures that were traded away for the promise of transcendent art. Marco, whose fictional story we followed, represents thousands of actual boys whose individual experiences have been lost to history, but whose collective suffering created one of the most beautiful and disturbing musical traditions ever recorded. The Catholic Church's relationship with this legacy remains complex and largely unexamined. While the institution eventually banned the practice and now officially condemns it, there has never been a formal acknowledgement of the systematic harm inflicted on children in service of sacred music. The Vatican archives contain extensive records documenting the Church's participation in and benefit from the castrato system. Yet these documents remain largely sealed from public examination. Modern Catholic apologists sometimes argue that the Church was merely a product of its times, that medieval and Renaissance sensibilities about children and bodily integrity were different from contemporary values. But this argument fails to account for the voices within the Church itself that questioned and condemned the practice from its earliest days. The institution chose to prioritize musical excellence over child welfare despite having moral frameworks that could have led to different choices. The medical understanding we now possess makes the scope of the tragedy even clearer. Castrating prepubescent boys didn't simply preserve their high voices, it fundamentally disrupted their entire hormonal development, affecting bone density, muscle development, emotional regulation, and cognitive function in ways that early practitioners couldn't have understood. Modern endocrinology reveals that these children were subjected to what amounts to a form of chemical lobotomy, their normal human development permanently altered to serve adult preferences for particular types of musical sound. Yet the music itself remains genuinely transcendent. When contemporary countertenors attempt to recreate castrato repertoire using natural techniques, the results are often beautiful but lack the otherworldly quality that made the originals so compelling. There was something in those altered voices, perhaps the very trauma that created them, that added dimensions of meaning that could never be achieved through training alone. This creates an ethical dilemma that continues to challenge musicians, musicologists, and audiences today. How do we appreciate art that was created through systematic abuse? How do we honor the beauty of the music while acknowledging the horror of its creation? How do we remember the victims without erasing the complexity of what their sacrifice produced? Some scholars argue for a complete boycott of castrato repertoire, suggesting that performing or recording this music perpetuates the exploitation of the children who were harmed to create it. Others contend that ignoring the repertoire does a disservice to both musical history and the memory of the castrati themselves, who found ways to create meaning and beauty within the constraints of their altered existence. Perhaps the most honest approach is to engage with this tradition while maintaining full awareness of its human cost. When we listen to Moreschi's recordings or attend performances of Handel's castrato roles, we should hear both the sublime beauty of the music and the voices of children crying out across centuries of silence. The aesthetic pleasure should always be tempered by historical consciousness, the artistic appreciation balanced by moral recognition of what was sacrificed to achieve that beauty. The castrato tradition also serves as a warning about the seductive power of institutional rationalization. The church, the conservatories, the opera houses, and the audiences who supported this system all found ways to justify practices they knew were harmful because the results were so extraordinarily beautiful. They created elaborate theological, artistic, and economic arguments for why the sacrifice of these children served higher purposes. Modern society is not immune to similar temptations. We continue to make choices that harm vulnerable populations when the benefits accrue to more powerful groups. The exploitation of child performers, the use of sweatshop labor to produce luxury goods, the environmental destruction that supports comfortable lifestyles all reflect the same fundamental pattern of justifying harm when it serves our preferences or needs. The boys who became castrati had their voices preserved, but their stories largely erased. They were transformed into instruments of beauty while being denied the full experience of human life. They sang of love while being unable to love completely, praised creation while having their own bodies altered beyond natural design, celebrated divinity while being treated as objects for human consumption. Alessandro Moreschi, in his final letter to a friend before his death in 1922, wrote, "I have spent my life giving voice to prayers I could never fully pray, singing of joys I could never fully experience, praising a God who allowed me to be broken so that others might find my brokenness beautiful. I do not know if this makes me blessed or cursed. I know only that my voice outlasted my body, and perhaps that is enough. His words capture the tragic ambiguity of the entire Castrato tradition, the genuine spiritual beauty that emerged from institutional cruelty, the authentic artistry that grew from systematic abuse, the divine music that was purchased with irreplaceable human wholeness. These contradictions cannot be resolved, but they must be remembered. In the end, the story of the castrati is not just about historical musical practices, or even about specific religious institutions. It is about the human capacity to transform suffering into beauty, to find meaning within systems that deny full humanity, and to create transcendence even when trapped within circumstances of profound limitation. It is about the voices that were preserved and the voices that were silenced, the music that was created and the lives that were sacrificed to create it. When we listen to those haunting 1,902 recordings of Alessandro Moreschi singing Ave Maria, we hear not just the last castrato, but the echo of thousands of children who were broken to make beauty possible. Their voices call across the centuries, not just in song but in accusation, not just in praise but in warning. They remind us that the most sublime human achievements often carry within them the seeds of our deepest shame, and that the price of transcendence is sometimes higher than any ethical society should be willing to pay. The boys who were castrated to sing for the Pope have been silent now for over a century, but their story continues to resonate, challenging us to examine our own complicity in systems that harm the vulnerable in service of beauty, progress, or divine purpose. In remembering them not just as musical curiosities, but as human beings whose wholeness was sacrificed for others' pleasure, we honor both their suffering and their art, ensuring that their voices, all of their voices, are finally heard.